In a small American town, there lived a woman everyone thought they knew. She fixed cars, kept to herself, and never asked for recognition. But sometimes, the quietest people carry the loudest stories, and one act of kindness was about to reveal just how extraordinary she truly was. Emma's garage sat at the edge of town, a squat brick building with a faded sign that simply read, "Auto Repair." Most people drove past it without much thought, the way you might pass a familiar landmark every day and never wonder about the story behind it. Inside, though, it was a different world, one filled with the low hum of old radios, the smell of oil and metal, and the steady rhythm of a woman who knew engines the way others knew lullabies. Emma wasn't the kind of person who sought attention. She wore her brown hair tied back, her coveralls permanently smudged with grease, her hands rough from years of hard work. To her customers, she was simply the mechanic who never overcharged, never complained, and never turned anyone away. If you were late on a bill, she worked with you. If you were stranded, she drove out in the rain. She didn't make much money, truth be told, her garage barely broke even some months, but she carried herself with a quiet dignity that made people trust her. What most of the town didn't know, because Emma never spoke about it, was that her life hadn't always been this quiet. Years earlier, she had worn a different uniform, lived a different rhythm, one filled with roaring engines, night skies, and missions few could imagine. But when she came home, she chose peace over pride, service over stories. Fixing cars gave her a sense of grounding. It kept her close to people, connected to her community, and far from the noise of recognition. Still, beneath her calm surface was a strength that seemed almost unshakable. Children who peeked into the garage saw her as unbreakable, like a hero in coveralls. Neighbors saw only kindness, and maybe a bit of mystery. Emma herself never thought much about it, she just believed in doing the next right thing, one repair, one person, one act of care at a time. And in a town that often overlooked her, nobody suspected that the quiet mechanic carried stories powerful enough to shake the ground beneath their feet. It was a bitter morning when Emma first noticed the battered old pickup sitting at the edge of her lot. The hood was cracked open, steam hissing faintly, and beside it stood a man bundled in a frayed coat that had clearly seen too many winters. His boots were worn thin, his face lined and weathered, and his eyes, though tired, still carried the sharpness of someone who had once stood tall with purpose. Emma wiped her hands on a rag and walked over. "Trouble?" she asked, her voice steady, without judgment. The man nodded. "She gave out on me. Don't got much left to keep her going." His words were heavy, as though they carried more than just the weight of the truck's breakdown. It didn't take long for Emma to piece things together. The patches on his coat, the way he carried himself, straight-backed even in defeat, spoke louder than words. He was a veteran, homeless now, from the looks of the bedroll in the back of the truck. Life after service had not been kind. Most mechanics would have asked about money, maybe suggested a tow. Emma didn't. She simply lifted the hood, rolled up her sleeves, and got to work. Hours passed as she replaced worn belts, cleaned the spark plugs, and coaxed the tired engine back to life. The man lingered nearby, watching in silence, as if unsure how to accept the gift of her time. When she finally slammed the hood shut and wiped the sweat from her brow, the old truck roared back with a strength it hadn't had in years. The man blinked hard, his voice catching. I don't have anything to pay you with." Emma just shook her head, offering a small smile. "Everyone deserves a way forward," she said simply. For the first time in what seemed like a long while, the man stood a little taller. He climbed into his truck with tears gathering in his eyes. When he drove away, exhaust trailing behind, Emma watched quietly, never realizing that her act of kindness was about to ripple far beyond what she could imagine. It started as a whisper, the kind of story that slips between neighbors over coffee at the diner or in line at the hardware store. Someone had seen it first, an enormous Navy helicopter circling low above the rooftops, the roar of its blades rattling windows and setting dogs barking. Then, without warning, it descended right onto the gravel lot in front of Emma's garage. By the time the rotors slowed, half the town had gathered at a distance, phones raised, eyes wide. Nothing like this ever happened here. The most excitement they usually saw was the county fair or Friday night football games. But a military helicopter, here, in their quiet town, it felt almost unreal, like a scene ripped from a movie. Kids ran barefoot from porches, their laughter swallowed by the thunder of the machine. Elderly couples stood arm in arm, shielding their faces from the wind as dust whipped across Main Street. People who had driven past Emma's garage for years without giving it much thought suddenly stopped and stared, as if seeing it, and her, for the very first time. And the questions began. Why here? Why her? Surely, the Navy didn't land helicopters in small towns without reason. Some whispered that maybe something terrible had happened. Others joked nervously about secret missions. But underneath the speculation, there was a shared thread of awe and unease. Emma herself had been working under a car when the shadow swept across her garage floor. She rolled out on her back, squinting up at the massive helicopter settling down just yards away. The ground trembled as if the whole town was holding its breath. The crew climbed out in crisp uniforms, their movements precise, purposeful. Their eyes scanned the lot, not the town, not the crowd, just Emma. The murmurs grew louder. Why her? Neighbors exchanged puzzled glances. For the first time, the quiet mechanic who had lived in their midst for years seemed wrapped in mystery. Whatever was happening, it was clear, Emma wasn't just the woman who fixed their cars. Something bigger, something none of them had imagined, was about to be revealed. The crowd pressed closer as the helicopter crew strode toward Emma's garage. Their boots hit the gravel with sharp certainty, uniforms crisp against the swirling dust. Emma stood in the doorway, rag still in her hand, her brow furrowed as though she were facing a stubborn engine. She didn't flinch at the noise, the stares, or the sudden weight of 100 curious eyes on her. One officer stepped forward, his expression a mixture of urgency and respect. "Ma'am, our pilot has taken ill. We're scheduled to move this Black Hawk immediately. We were told you could help." The words landed like a spark in dry grass. The crowd gasped. Help. What could Emma, their quiet mechanic, possibly do for a Navy helicopter crew? A few neighbors chuckled nervously, assuming it was some misunderstanding. Emma, after all, had never spoken of anything beyond engines, carburetors, and brake pads. But Emma's face didn't shift into confusion or protest. Instead, her eyes narrowed just slightly, as though weighing a decision she had hoped never to face again. She looked past the officer at the helicopter, its dark body gleaming in the afternoon sun, and for a moment, something in her posture changed. Those who knew Emma only as the woman who patched their tires or tuned their trucks suddenly saw a different silhouette, shoulders straighter, chin lifted, a quiet authority settling over her. It was the posture of someone who had been here before, in moments of pressure, when lives depended on steady hands. She took a breath, folded the rag, and slipped it into her pocket. "I'll do it," she said simply. The murmurs turned into stunned silence. Mothers held their children tighter, teenagers exchanged wide-eyed glances, and old men shook their heads in disbelief. Could it be true? Emma walked forward with calm certainty, each step echoing louder than the last. She hadn't sought this moment, but it had found her. And in the stunned faces of her neighbors, she finally saw the truth. The past she had buried was about to rise into the open sky. Emma climbed into the cockpit of the Black Hawk as if she were stepping into a long-forgotten home. The smell of aviation fuel, the tight embrace of the seat, the panel of glowing instruments, everything rushed back with startling familiarity. Her fingers hovered over the controls, steady and confident, like a pianist returning to a beloved song. Outside, the crowd held its breath. They watched as this woman, someone who had changed their oil, patched their flats, and quietly waved to them at the grocery store, now strapped herself into the pilot's harness of a military helicopter. It didn't make sense, and yet it fit in some strange, undeniable way. The officer leaned in and spoke softly. "Are you sure you're ready?" Emma met his gaze, her expression calm. "I was born ready for this," she replied. And then, with a twist of her wrist, the engines roared to life. The earth trembled as the rotor blades began their thunderous spin, kicking up dust that swirled into the sky. The crowd shielded their eyes, but no one moved away. Every soul in town stood rooted, unable to look anywhere but at Emma. With practiced ease, she guided the helicopter upward. It lifted from the ground smoothly, no hesitation, no falter. The massive machine obeyed her like an old friend. In that moment, Emma wasn't the quiet mechanic. She was Lieutenant Emma Carter again, the Navy pilot who had once carried lives through combat zones, who had trained her nerves in the harshest conditions, who had given up the skies for the peace of a small-town garage. Gasps echoed as the Black Hawk soared above the rooftops, dipping gracefully before leveling out. Emma's neighbors looked on in awe, realizing they were witnessing a piece of history, not from a stranger on the news, but from someone they thought they had known. And as the helicopter circled back, dust sweeping the streets once more, every eye was wet, every heart was pounding. The secret was out. Emma had been more than they ever imagined, and perhaps more than she had allowed herself to remember. And so, the town learned a lesson they would never forget. True greatness doesn't shout, it whispers through kindness, and rises when the world needs it most. Emma had repaired more than just a veteran's truck, she had repaired hope itself.